Then I was out because I got in late and I slept all day yesterday. And I got up to go to dinner and I put weight on it and like my weight picked me up in the car and we went to urgent care. They were like, yeah, we're making an appointment for a specialist in the morning. We can't help you. Yeah. Here's some drugs. Like that's all. Yeah. I'm like, yeah, I'll take my chances with you to leave. Yeah. But I'm going to my art and they looked at just enough that it doesn't.
Hey, Jan, can you hear me?
Yeah, but the best part is.
Awesome, thanks. Appreciate the sound check. Okay, guys.
Let me see where Amy is. Amy is not one to miss.
Okay. Well, I did start the recording, so she should be okay. So it's hard to believe we're in week 14 of the class.
Shut your mouth.
Craziness.
I think that would be on my respect.
Yeah, no, I completely get it. So yeah, but that's okay. It's hopefully it's at least comforting to the students that the instructor's struggling just as hard as the students are. So at week 14, we're going to talk about procedural knowledge. So this will finish up our discussion of procedural knowledge, and let me reset the slideshow so that it stops advancing automatically like that. Let's see, manually. There we go. Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about kind of putting us in the right context for the discussion about Arden syntax and rules as procedural knowledge. We're going to talk a little bit about how and where rules might be used, and I'm pretty sure that some of you guys that work in maybe public health or in bioinformatics, where I don't work as much, can think of other applications for rules that I might not know about, which would be cool to hear. We're going to talk a little bit about salience and architectures for managing rules, and then we're going to go over in detail the Arden syntax. And Arden syntax is a really old standard. We'll see just how old as we get into the lecture. I always debate whether or not to teach Arden syntax or another rules syntax. I always end up going back to Arden because it really is the standard in healthcare, even though it's very old. And it's one of the seminal works in the field of clinical informatics by George Herbshack, who is up at Columbia. And so in deference to the seminal nature of the work, I usually go back to Arden, which is why we're doing an older thing today. So there's some learning objectives. These are also posted on the week in Blackboard. I just posted them about maybe 20 or 30 minutes before I hopped on 6:30 to come down to class. And so they're basically around putting rules in the context of procedural and declarative knowledge, putting rules in the context of some of the declarative knowledge stuff that we have worked with earlier, like data elements and control terminology, and how they sort of work together. We are going to go over Arden syntax. You don't need to memorize any Arden syntax, but I want you to see it, to see how people think about writing rules, at least on the clinical informatics side. We're going to talk about some limitations of Arden syntax and a key sort of challenge across the discipline of biomedical informatics that was first sort of aptly named out of the work on Arden syntax. And then we're going to talk a little about rules management. So jumping in, you know, we did a lot earlier in the semester with declarative knowledge, like data values in a database, facts or assertions that we might make. I tend to think of declarative knowledge as static knowledge. It's like it's a statement, like the door is blonde wood, or the carpet is blue, or whatever. Procedural knowledge is a little different because we need procedural knowledge, right? Stuff, processes, how you do things, sequence of events, logic conditions that might apply and when they might apply. And so thus the sort of bifurcation in the knowledge into declarative versus procedural knowledge. So we'll talk about two kinds of procedural knowledge. The first is standard operating procedures. How many of you guys, if I say standard operating procedure, like have experienced them in the work setting and know what I'm talking about? Okay, not everybody. So standard operating procedures are generally, think of it like a recipe for a work process. I'm going to use for the lab, for the procedural knowledge, the flowchart lab, I'm going to actually post a standard operating procedure that we're working on now for the data processing. So it comes out of the area of clinical research informatics. And I'm going to ask you guys for the lab to do the flowchart for it. And so basically what a standard operating procedure is it's a text document that's a step-by-step procedure for how you do something. So for example, if we're talking about building a data system, the first step might be drawing a context diagram for the data system. The second step might be drawing a use case diagram. And then the third step might be coming to grips with what the functional specifications for the system are and getting those written. And so those sort of steps would go into a standard operating procedure, maybe for system design and development. And so SOPs beyond that are pretty self-explanatory. I think once you see the example for the lab, you'll be like, oh, geez, it's easy. It's just like a written recipe for how you do something. But it's a very important part of procedural knowledge, especially for those of us that are going to work in a regulated environment. A lot of folks in clinical research informatics will work in a regulated environment. Some folks in bioinformatics will work in a regulated environment. Some folks in clinical informatics will work in a regulated environment, and that will require the use of documented standard procedures. And then the ones that we're going to spend all the rest of the time on today, for the most part, are rules. And we'll get into them in detail. And so the last thing I'm going to say about standard operating procedures is that they can, like most stuff we've talked about, they can occur at multiple levels of detail. And so there's an ISO standard called ISO 9000 for quality management systems. And it's basically, it's a process and a way in which an organization can assure that the services or products that they produce are produced consistently and predictably at the desired level of quality. And the way to do that is to put in place a quality management system. One part of a quality management system is documented processes. In other words, standardized and controlled processes. And so people that are working in an ISO 9000 environment also have a need for standard operating procedures. And they sort of, the way that ISO manages the hierarchy and levels of abstraction is at the top there's a quality policy that sort of says what some institution will do and won't do. For example, the quality policy that we're working on for research data management here basically says that the research processes need to conform to regulations, that data need to be documented sufficiently to support reuse, and that data need to be produced at the quality level consistent to support the conclusions that will be drawn from the research. So those real high-level statements are what we mean by quality policy. Then an organization usually writes a quality manual that talks about multiple components of the quality management system. And those components include things like technology infrastructure, for example, where you're automating processes. They include standardized and controlled written processes. They include personnel management and position descriptions, management, review of people's work and oversight of that. And they also include project management, so management of individual projects. That's how we think of the quality manual, the quality management system for research data. There are other ways you might formulate it, but that's just sort of an example. Then under the quality manual, what the quality manual will do is carve up all of the work processes for whatever service or product an organization is delivering, and carving up the overall work process, partitions it off into lumps. Like earlier in the semester, we talked about research, data collection and management. So we had identify data elements, define data elements, measure and record stuff, manage data, maybe data processing, and then analysis. So those that's one way we might partition up the research process in terms of data collection and management. And then we would associate a standard operating procedure with each of those partitions of the research process. Usually it's done at a finer grain level. As we're working on our SOPs for our data center here, we're of course documenting them at a finer grain level. So let me actually show that while we're here. And let's see, it would be quality manual, there it is. So this is an example of quality manual for the large data center. And the components it has talks about leadership responsibility, the structure of the quality management system in terms of the scope and the responsibilities, how we partition up the processes into procedures that are written and followed, and then how we measure and control those processes to assure consistency of our data. And so how we talk about that is, let me scroll down. So these two diagrams, basically, if you look at the shaded area in the bottom, is clinical study, development, startup, conduct, and closeout. And then we partition that more finely into data collection and processing aspects. And so when we think about SOPs, like we have an SOP for protocol development, and we have an SOP for site selection, and we have an SOP for site startup. So we have an SOP, we actually put data acquisition and processing together. So we have an SOP for lots of those boxes on that diagram correspond to standard operating procedures that exist. The reason why we do that is because we feel that having a quality management system with all those 4 components that I mentioned earlier, the human resources management, the technology, the standard and control processes, and then the project management aspects, that's how to make sure that the product that we produce is not dependent on the skills of any one human, but is consistent across having different people come and leave positions, and students involved, and training people, and all that sort of stuff, and over time. And so it really boils down to, on the process side, carving up into partitioning your total process, and then writing controlled processes for each part of that process. So this is the general kind of data collection and processing, and then we also did one for the infrastructure build, which is getting an electronic data capture system installed, qualified, and validated for the particular regulations that happen to apply here. So that's what we mean when I say partitioning your process up into tasks, and then dropping down and writing standard operating procedures for those tasks. And so the standard operating procedure that I think I'm going to give you, I'm either going to give you data acquisition and processing, or case report form design, so that you can take that text and practice drawing the flow chart for it. Okay. So then, if we sort of follow that hierarchy down, each of the standard operating procedures, we're not done there, because those, even though we've dropped down several levels from that high-level quality policy statement, they're still pretty high level. And so standard operating procedures have things attached to them, like templates, forms, checklists, flow chart to show the process. And those things are generally called job aids. In other words, things that somebody doing the job would refer to help them, like a checklist or a form. And then some procedures might be even more specific. For example, if we have a database setup standard operating procedure, maybe we use 2 different systems here. And so then we might have work instruction for each of those systems that would provide system-specific detail. And the reason is that because we operate in a regulated environment, when an auditor comes to check our quality system, it could be either pre-award when a pharmaceutical or somebody else is considering having us process their data. They want to come and make sure that we have a quality system that gives them some indication that we can deliver what we're proposing to do. On the flip side, when a marketed therapeutics under consideration at the Food and Drug Administration for marketing authorization, they'll also come out and do audits of the sites and the data coordinating centers that were involved in processing the data to support that marketing application. And so what an auditor will do, they generally care about the quality system, and they also care about the objective evidence. So they'll take the standard operating procedures and compare those to the regulations to see how compliant your process as you plan it to be is with the regulations. And then they'll sit down and they'll look at data that you have processed and documentation that was produced in the course of processing the data to see that you actually complied with the processes as you planned them. So sort of two parts to those audits. And if you have a quality management system of your own that you're trying to control, then you will pay an independent auditor to come in and do that same process for you, as well as have sort of internal controls to check on it. So the idea is that it's documented and stated what you're going to do, and then you measure it intermittently throughout the performance of the process to control it. Make sense? And so that's why SOPs are such an important part of procedural knowledge, because whether you're in a lab setting or in a clinical setting or in research, there's always this concept of consistent service level, consistent quality that needs to be adhered to. Okay, so let's talk about rules. So this is an example of a rule. Patients discharged post-coronary event and without contraindication should have aspirin listed as a discharge medication. And so the idea is that there are national treatment guidelines that we want to comply with as an institution for treatment if it's a clinical institution, but other types if it's another type of organization. And so one of those things that are expected are compliance with clinical guidelines. This is a statement out of one of the clinical guidelines. And so we want to help our physicians at the institution conform to the clinical guidelines to the best evidence. And so we need a way basically to collect all these rules that are out there in the world and get them into our information system such that they're available to help clinicians. Medications for and contraindicated are a big area of decision support. Medication management is, for example, if there's two antibiotics that are prescribed together and there's an order to stop one, then you want to make sure the others stop, that kind of stuff. Contraindications to meds, checking med allergies, any of that stuff, people use rules for. And unfortunately, and this is sort of an old reference, but at the time of the publication, only about 50% or so of adults received recommended care for some really typical conditions like community-acquired pneumonia or asthma or hypertension. Hopefully it's a little higher now, but given the heavy lift everybody's had to implement their electronic health record as we've come up on the adoption curve since 2010, my guess is that it's probably not a lot higher, because when folks are putting all that effort to implementation, they're not putting a lot of effort into optimizing how the system's working for clinicians. So clinical decision support is a big way to increase guideline adherence, and more importantly, to increase the number of patients that are getting the recommended care. And so there's, for operationalizing clinical decision support, there's sort of processing it, getting the knowledge from wherever it is. In this case, it might be in clinical guidelines. Now there are commercial services that produce knowledge that can be consumed in clinical decision support systems. There's multiple modalities of clinical decision support, and there's a whole class in the curriculum in the clinical informatics track about decision support. So it goes over templates and as decision support, order sets, alerts and reminders as decision support, information visualization and presentation as decision support. Many, many ways that we can intervene cognitively with a provider at the point of care in order to help their decision making and hopefully meet the fundamental theorem and improve human performance. And then the last part is there has to be some maintenance. You know, once we get this knowledge, these rules, and we have them, and they're accurate and up to date today, they're going to be different tomorrow. And so we need a process as an organization for how do we update a rule in the system. And how do we know which data file, you know, were run under the updated rule versus the old rule and all that kind of stuff. So using knowledge in information systems in this way to support human performance sort of ushers in additional tasks associated with knowledge maintenance that people often don't think about when they set out to use knowledge. And then they put rules or knowledge in the system and then they leave it, and then knowledge gets kind of stale, and then people realize it's not very up to date and stop using it. So it becomes ineffective if people don't do this last part of knowledge maintenance. And so conceptually, how it works is, and I'll kind of talk through this in the concept of some research. Jan, I'm going to use your project. So Jan, who's online today, he's a PhD student over in the UA Little Rock Information Quality Program, and his doctoral work is using rules-based data quality monitoring in health information systems. And so Jan has 6,000 or more rules for looking for data quality problems within the health system. Things like females can't have a prostatectomy, all sorts of good stuff like that. And so what Jan did is he basically went out and looked for sources of knowledge. So there are a lot of sources of knowledge. There's lists of age and gender disallowed diagnoses and procedures that payers use in order to clean and look at data. There's ontologies like the drug ontology that Dr. Bruckhausen developed and still works on. That's a valid knowledge source. For example, I think it has contraindications in it. I think Kat might be more familiar with it than me. There are other knowledge sources like structured product label. Whenever a drug's approved to go on the market, the drug label is now structured, semi-structured in XML. A lot of it's text, but there is some structured data in there. And so what I'm talking about are knowledge sources. There are also commercial knowledge sources that are available. Folks curate the knowledge sources and make it available for subscription, and that's becoming more and more used, where the architecture where you're not updating rules constantly, but you're updating a knowledge source and using the same rules. A little more efficient. And so you have knowledge sources, then you move over to knowledge acquisition, getting the knowledge from the sources. Jan probably spent most of his first semester looking at knowledge sources and evaluating knowledge sources for his rules. We will talk a little, we'll close out our procedural knowledge topic at the beginning of next week with a quick talk about knowledge acquisition. But that's basically ways of knowing, ways of getting the information, in this case, rules. Then you have to formalize that knowledge. So the knowledge sources that Jan used, lists of age and gender disallowed diagnoses and procedures, we get them from third-party payers. They're publicly available. We have no idea if they're correct or reasonable or not. So you have to kind of evaluate that knowledge and formalize it, figure out how you're going to use it in your rules. For the same for ontologies, with the structured product label, there is some knowledge that's in text, unstructured fields. We have to make a decision whether it's worth it for us to mine that information out. For this initial project, we're not doing that, but it's a great target. And then we might even want to go back to the standards setting organization, Health Level 7, that manages the structured product label, and work with the stakeholders for that standard and work over the next few years to get some of that unstructured stuff more structured so that it serves as a better, more productive knowledge source, both for clinical care and for research. So there's a lot in formalizing that knowledge. The more data standardization the industry as a whole participates in, the more formalized and more usable the knowledge will be for decision support. And then there's, of course, a formalized problem. For us, we separated along these lines. The formalized knowledge are in tables, the ones I just talked about. The formalized problem is that we want those tables to tell us about things that shouldn't exist, like males that have babies or things like that, or procedures that are only done on infants being done on adults. And so we formalize those problems in terms of rule templates. So Jan took 6,000 and some rules and collapsed them down into about 20 templates. So the formalized knowledge and the knowledge tables, the formalized problems that we're looking for, like for diagnosis X, procedure Y is not allowed, or whatever, or age or gender. And so those are our formalized problems. And then we use an inference machine or rules engine that takes the rules and the knowledge, combines them together, and then executes them over a data source. So rules-based decision support generally kind of follows this paradigm. And then the solution we get out, for us, it's a flag that we would store associated with a data value that says, whoop, this data value was triggered, rule number 1, record number 839 in the knowledge table. And in clinical decision support, for the solution, you would want an alert maybe to pop up on the electronic medical record screen at the point of care. For public health, for example, if a patient has a reportable condition, you would want an alert to pop up and a little button for the clinician that says, click here, report to the health department. It's legally required. So there could be many different solutions that you might get or use out of this architecture. And so this is sort of another look at an architecture for monitoring clinical events. So basically we look, there's some user and some electronic health record over there on the left. There's some technology, which is monitoring for events. For example, it's scanning every diagnosis that's put into the system on the user interface to flag any reportable conditions. And it's using the knowledge base in order to do that, to run those flags. And then it's going to put some alert up. And then at the bottom, there are people working on the problem of acquiring knowledge through automated means, whether it's from text information or data, using data mining techniques out of structured data. It's a very active area of inquiry right now to do that. So sort of, again, an architecture view of it. There are a lot of standards out there. I mentioned we're going over Arden, but it's one of the older ones. These are some of the other ones. There are probably even new ones out now. The top list are the current ones at the time, or the draft standards for use. Then there's ones that have also been proposed or in progress. I think virtual medical record is actually in progress now. It was actually designed to solve the problem that Arden syntax made widely knowable for everyone. So just some examples of some rule standards. There are other standards in particular for quality measures. If you look at the National Quality Forum and the AHRQ's USHIC, United States Health Information Knowledge Base, something like that. They actually have tons of performance measures, some of which have been tested and validated, others which might not have. But there's a standard HQMF for formally defining a quality measure. And when I say formally defining a rule or quality measure, I mean taking a natural language statement and rendering it computable. So putting it in some programming language or some formalized syntax such that it's executable by a computer. So HQMF is of particular interest because every clinical facility has to deal with quality measures and wants to, at some level, measure their processes so that they can manage and improve them. And so for a quality measure, quality measures are a little different than decision support rules in that they always have a numerator and a denominator. So like for the first example that we looked at, the patient with coronary artery event discharged on aspirin or not. So the denominator would be all patients experiencing a coronary artery event and not having a contraindication. And the numerator would be the number of those that were actually discharged on aspirin, just for a simple one. There's some more examples on the slide, but for the E measures, you need a numerator and denominator. For clinical decision support, it's often not a numerator-denominator situation. Some of them are algorithmic and are calculations, but they're not a measure by nature, like the authority measure is. Make sense? Okay. And I'll just say one more thing. The sort of the name of the game with decision supports and patients receiving the standard care, the goal for that is that when we have these text-based guidelines, so clinical professional societies will do systematic literature reviews, they'll write guidelines. Those guidelines sort of represent the expected standard of care for a patient. These algorithms, decision support algorithms, are what's used to encode that best practice knowledge into the EHR on the user interface, so that that if there is this coronary event in aspirin expectation for care, if an organization puts in appropriate decision support based on that, they can drastically increase their percentage of patients that are receiving the recommended care. So that's why people are so interested in decision support, is so that they can improve care processes or safety. So the Arden syntax is only one formalism for defining rules. There are many. I think Arden so far is the only one really for healthcare decision support, but I might be wrong. There are other generalizable ones, like constraint languages and stuff like that, that are not specific to healthcare. And so two efforts, the HELP effort at Utah and the CARE effort at Regenstrief, sort of those project teams came together and formed Arden syntax in Health Level 7 in 1989. Is the history of it. There are multiple versions of Arden syntax published as standards. The unit of representation for a rule in Arden syntax is called an MLM, or a medical logic module. And basically the definition of an MLM is enough logic and data to make a single decision. So these are little. I mean, there's a lot of stuff and metadata around them, but they're little. It's a single decision, like, you know, discharging somebody post-coronary event and making sure they're discharged on aspirin. Importantly, the result of a medical logic module needs to be actionable. So stored with the medical logic module also has to be sort of the text for the alert or reminder that's going to display on the screen for the clinician. And so they're used for alerts. They're used for interpretation. Sort of to help the provider maybe make a diagnosis or interpret test results. And they're also used to screen. For example, you know, if a patient comes in for a primary care visit and they have diabetes and they haven't had a foot exam or an eye exam in the last year, then a screening message would alert and say, hey, needed exams. Make sense? So what does a medical logic module look like? So it's basically a text file, and it has three main categories in it. There's a maintenance category, which is sort of life cycle stuff in order to manage the rules or the medical logic modules. There's library information on the medical logic module, and then a knowledge template. And so how it works is there's some event that runs and that occurs. There's data that's produced from that event. The medical logic module, the decision box, is run on the data that's produced from that event. It produces some sort of a alert, whatever, and there's some action taken as a result of that. So rules are really the combination of logic running over data in order to prompt some action. And so Arden syntax was created really in recognition that clinicians shouldn't really be writing a lot of computer code. So Arden syntax is a more human-readable, user-friendly way so that clinicians can write the rules to support clinical decision making. And there's an easy MLM, which was developed at Columbia, where George Hrpshak is, and they basically looked at clinician authoring of rules and whether or not the format for authoring was conducive to clinicians successfully writing and executing rules. And indeed, they found that it was. So some syntax things about medical logic modules. If you do plan on sitting for the physician boards, often there are a few questions dotted in there about syntax. They'll give you an example code and say, is this XML, JSON, Arden, Java, what is it? And you'd be expected to at least sort of pick up what syntax it is. So for medical logic modules, there's just some syntax notes, no spaces before colons or double semicolons, information about the slots, that they have to be unique, and information about terminating slots, and that there is always an end statement that we saw at the example one, like the end there. And medical logic modules now use XML, although the seminal sort of tutorial on it by George Hrpshak is not an XML, but you can write MLMs in XML now. And so I'm going to kind of go through what they look like, and I posted that there's a full tutorial for how to write them. It's old, but it's the best thing out there just to kind of learn MLMs and kind of get familiar with it. So this is kind of what goes in the maintenance slot. And by slot, it just means that those three slots divide up the medical logic module into three categories or three areas. Maintenance is the first of those areas. So it has the title. For this one, it's a screen for hypokalemia with digoxin therapy. Then it gives it a file name and a version, which help to manage the knowledge within the institution. The one happens to be from Columbia, and George wrote it himself. And it has a date and whether a statement of whether the rule is in production or not. There are usually different stages to life cycle management, maybe draft, maybe in review, maybe production, maybe deprecated. So this is the type of information that would be in the maintenance portion of a medical logic module. The library slot or portion of the medical logic module would have information about the purpose of the MLM so that other people that came later could pick it up and understand it. It would have an explanation of the algorithm for the medical logic module. Some key words, for example, if you want to search and find, once you start writing these, you can get in the hundreds or thousands of rules that an institution has to manage. And so keywords are helpful. And also the citations. As the science changes, versions of clinical guidelines change. You might need to let your decision support rules flux with the change in clinical guidelines. So the citation information will be really important to help you manage that as things are versioned up. So that's the library category. And then the knowledge category is kind of the business end. So this is where the algorithm is. All that other stuff helps us manage the medical logic module. The knowledge category really tells us the algorithm. And so it lists the data for the potassium storage, and then it says it's an event, and then in the curly brackets, this is probably the most famous part of the Arden syntax. In curly brackets, that's the space where you put the variable names in your own system. So for example, these would be the variable names that are used at Columbia that George Hrpshak would have been writing his modules against. If we worked with Sharab and Mahanez to write some against the data warehouse here, Sharab and Mahanez would have to tell us what these variables are for the warehouse. So we would put our own institution stuff, like this variable is in this table, and you get to the number that you need by selecting only this and this and this. So you would put full syntax for queries in here in curly brackets. You can. And so the curly braces problem in medical informatics, as it's sort of been coined, is basically sort of it signifies the fact that we can't share rules and knowledge today because people aren't using the same data models and there aren't underlying data standards. So if we wrote rules for our EPIC instance here, they're in EPIC, they're called BPAs or best practice advisories. So if we wrote some here, we couldn't send them down the road to Baptist and say, in other words, we can't call up Baptist and say, yo, dude, you write the first half of them and I'll write the second half of them and then we'll switch. Would not work because his or her half would not run on my system and mine would not run on their system because I don't have their stuff in curly brackets. I have my own system stuff in curly brackets. So the curly braces or the curly bracket problem basically means that rules are not shareable between systems. So hearkening back to the work that Jan is doing, although our initial demonstration project is not written on a common data model, the goal is to eventually write this on a common data model so that we can tell people, look, here's 6,000 rules you can use to clean your data warehouse. Put your data warehouse in the OMOP common data model, and then these rules will run on your data warehouse. Just sort of sidestepping completely the curly braces problem by virtue of using a common data model and standard control terminologies. Unfortunately, EHRs don't adhere to any of those kind of standards today. So you guys, any questions about, I'm not an expert in the actual syntax of Arden, but it is important to know that the actual algorithm goes in the knowledge slot, and that's where you would write it.
So this is more so used, so physicians tend to make these rules? Is that how I'm interpreting this?
Well, so in general, decision support rules should be either prompted by, authored by, and or tested by a physician. Not all organizations do those three things the same. Some organizations have staff that monitor National Guidelines Clearinghouse and clinical guidelines that the clinical specialties have said we practice by these guidelines. So, if we're cardiologists, we're going to say, oh, we use AHA or ACC or STS or some other guidelines. And then they may have staff that monitor those guidelines, and when the guidelines are updated, automatically update the knowledge and then have it tested by a physician, reviewed and or tested in the sundry ways. They could be code review, looking at it with eyeballs. It could be more official testing, put it in test data and making it fire and not fire and stuff like that. Other organizations, physicians will author them. There's training in EPIC and other electronic health records for physician builders. Because under the learned intermediary sort of precedent that's been set with marketed therapeutics in the United States, which basically came from the pharmaceutical end, which said that because the FDA and pharmaceutical companies put out black box warnings and other safety alerts to physicians, the physician is the learned intermediary. And so the pharmaceutical is not going to be held accountable for how the physician practices and uses their drug. And so that's been applied liberally to electronic health records so that all of the liability for mistakes, for example, in authoring knowledge or lack of testing knowledge or whatever might have happened, the liability for that accrues to the organization and the physician, unfortunately. And there have been lawsuits. I just saw another one the other day against EPIC for something. There will continue to be. Who knows if the precedent will ever be set aside or not. But currently, that's sort of the given philosophy, which is why institutions that don't have physicians prompt and test and or write them themselves are taking a huge risk with medical care, because it's the physician and the CEO of the hospital that are going to be wearing orange, not the person in IT that programmed the module. But not everybody understands that, and not everybody understands the risk that they're taking when they author decision support in an electronic health record that's at the sharp end, meaning at the point of care, that changes the way that physicians practice medicine or have a relationship with the material, the knowledge, the data in the system. How it is today? Yes.
So I was reading news today, and they said that there's a new classification for high blood pressure out from the AHA and
Yeah.
So who works at UAMS? Can we bring in us an example? Show us how it's going to work at UAMS. What happens? How are they going to?
Yeah. So here's
flag it?
how it should happen. So in family medicine, there's a David Nielsen, who's a family medicine doc. He's also in clinical informatics group. David would probably be all over that and say, oh, it's out now, need to change the support. So there's probably a best practice advisory in Epic that says something like, if your blood pressure is over this amount on 3 consecutive measures in some period, or some other more complicated logic, because these things can get long as hell.
Yeah, they changed a lot.
Yeah. So there's that logic. So he would go and say, well, it's time to update it. So at UAMS, it's actually not the physicians that write it. So somebody in IT writes it, and they're I can't vouch for who does the testing. I don't think it's the physician. But I don't work in that group, so don't take my word for it. But what would normally happen is the physician in charge or in that specialty would say, hey, time to update, the guideline changed. There would be some prompt to initiate the development of the update to the medical logic module or an EPIC, best practice advisory decision support rule. That would get updated, that would get tested. Once it's been tested, it would get moved to production, and then it would show up on the screen. And then depending on how well they programmed it or not, how much they care about order of operations of rules, when it runs the first time, if the new guidelines are more conservative, meaning that more of us now have high blood pressure, which is in the case of this, then all of a sudden it's going to run and all these patients are going to flag. And so when everybody comes in for their next visit, there's going to be a BPA that says, hypertension. And there's going to be all these antihypertensive prescriptions written over the next 2 months, 6 months as patients come back for their first visit after the guidelines. So that's kind of how it play out.
Just as an also, at the VA, anybody who enrolls someone in research or has a research project can set up their own flag. So we do have a mechanism in which any regular person can set up alerts. It's more than that, but not looking like code. There's a lot of stuff that goes to it to get it to stick on. They also have flags for violent patients, escape risks, all of this stuff will come up as soon as you
drug seekers.
Yes, among the many. But one of the trickier problems that we've had from the research standpoint relates to drug flagging, drug-drug interaction, drug contraindications, because the investigational drug database or data table doesn't bounce off against those drug-drug interactions.
Oh, so you need a new rule.
Yes, and we noticed it in research before pharmacy noticed it or before people at point of care noticed it, but we haven't been able to, at least at the local level, I don't know how far they took it up, fix it. It's terrible.
Yeah. So there should be some decision support group, clinical informatics group, decision support.
The CAC's clinical application coordinator specialist or whatever. We tried, we did, and we wound up just sending out notification to all of our physicians saying if there's a research flag on someone's record, you have to check what research it is. That's very clunky compared to getting a red box on the screen that says, oh, this person's taking omeprazole. Don't give them this, or whatever.
Can they bypass the flag? Do they?
They sure can.
Oh, yeah.
And oftentimes do.
Override.
When it's a research one, that says, who cares?
Yeah. But the critical thing, though, is for a physician that's used to practicing at the point of care and they're used to getting alerts for contraindications. All of a sudden, the patient's on study med, and we know the study med can't be given with an SSRI, or the patient's going to turn orange permanently.
I think it was Plavix and omeprazole. Maybe omeprazole prevents Plavix from doing what it's
From
supposed
working,
to do
yeah.
as much. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when that happens in a research study,
Yeah, well, my brain's going about 18 different directions with just that statement that, you know, they need a new rule. I mean, we've run into some of this with some of the research we've done on the ethics side.
Be careful, because, you know, sometimes it doesn't look like a drug because it's a chemical that's a couple numbers and
it's a study agent.
right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times they're blinded, so the person may be receiving the new agent, they may be receiving not something. Yeah. But it should bounce.
Well, here's
It should.
Talk to each other.
So here's a slightly more question. Has there been a negative or deadly impact or result?
You ain't been in the news.
It's not going to change to you until there is.
Yeah, well, the challenge is that we know that clinicians, when some error occurs because of health IT, clinicians don't consider it a medical error.
Right.
So it doesn't occur to them to report it to the voluntary reporting database. So we just don't know.
That's very true. Dr. Powell was telling me that.
Yeah, it's huge. The other thing is that once you've conditioned providers to expect alerts for contraindications, they know that they can relax that part of their thinking at the point of care. And so in the exception situation where it's a study agent and the rule's not running for it, they're not gonna realize, and they're gonna be more prone to not pick up that drug can't be given with some contraindication for whatever class the investigation is in, whatever. And so it can really be impactful at the point of care. And there have been a lot of studies done about iatrogenesis, or unintended adverse effects of health IT, where there are cognitive issues like that, like you condition providers to work one way, and then, oh, but in these cases it doesn't work that way, and so then they have errors in those.
Remember, the particular omeprazole incident in my head is that the person was assigned to receive either placebo or ticagrelor. They had a scent placed, and the person who discharged them prescribed them more ticagrelor. As it turned out, they were randomized to placebo, so they didn't get 2 times as much Plavix, I think.
That will be good.
Yeah, they could have, though. They got lucky is what happened. I cannot express to you how much luck takes place to protect people. It's terrible. But we notified and we're working on it and all that kind of stuff, but it just, if it's only 3 pages of rule, that would seem like it'd be kind of okay.
It would, but chances are they probably got a list of several hundred they need to write, and maybe like one person writing them and testing them.
Yeah.
And they're doing all the critical guideline updates.
Like this type of pressure stuff.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because in these EHR implementations, leadership sort of gets the fact, oh, I'm going to pay several $1 million for this thing, many millions of dollars, and once it's in, it's good, and I'm going to get cost savings. They don't kind of think forward, and nobody informs them really accurately about what the maintenance cost of this stuff is and what the resources are that are needed. So like in general, in a hospital our size, we would have, maybe 20 to 50 or more physicians on some, 10, 20, whatever % effort, writing BPAs and building order sets and stuff like that. So every specialty, every unit would have a designated physician builder that would be the clinical mind over those order sets and those aspects of the EHR that influence the practice of medicine. Here we have a half an FTE.
Well, and at VA, they're going to be replacing Vista because they're.
Oh, are they?
They are.
They are.
Thus endeth an era.
I cannot.
What are they going to?
Whatever dia, not starts with a C.
Cerner. DOD picked Cerner.
Yeah. So I mean, okay. We'll see how that goes, but I don't think that they're probably not wanting to invest too much effort in updating anything.
Right. Yeah, we don't. I remember Tom saying he was cutting off changes. I forget what the window was before an upgrade. So unless it's critical, like a patient safety issue, they they'll make those kind of cutoffs just to have some type of sane approach at managing the change control over the system. But yeah, the knowledge management is going to be a very huge growing job category that's needed, because the way to really get improved performance out of these systems is through decision support, and a lot of the decision support is best done with rules, even though this syntax is very old. So this is just the rest of the knowledge slot. And then the data part in there has those curly braces. That's where your mapping happens. You can see them, right? I mean, it's kind of blurry, but okay. And this is just another slide on the curly braces problem. So, so within the data slots, there's other stuff in there. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, because the purpose of this is not for you to be an ardent expert. The purpose is for you to see a syntax and a method for managing rules. But here, within the data slot, you put statements in, you build expressions in there. That := is setting a value or a variable. Then there's some if-then logic, like that is the business end of the rule. If this bad situation occurs, put an alert on the screen. And then there's read, which is pulling data from the institution's database to execute the logic over. And then there's some expressions you can put in there. So it's like an equation. You evaluate something, calculate something, and return a result from it. There is an evoke slot. So this is kind of cool. This is what triggers the rule to run, right? Because you can't just if you put the rules out there and just let them sit, like you have to have something that says run when. So for example, there's, if you wanted to check for duplicate patients to make sure that you're not splitting a patient's data over 2 charts when some new person shows up to the ER, when a new registration record is when somebody hits submit on the registration screen, you might want that event to trigger running the duplicate check in the system. Make sense? When new lab values are returned, you might want that to trigger any of the decision support that's based on lab values. So as soon as those lab values hit the system, if somebody triggers a decision support alert based on them, that would fire immediately. It would run and fire immediately. So these things it's alive. Like once you put it into production, with the way that you set it up to be triggered, to operate, to run, it's alive. And when you put 100 of them, 200 of them, 2,000 of them in there at once, they're all alive at the same time. And so doing testing to look at the user experience on the front end for dealing with the rule results, like if somebody gets alert, that is not going to be effective. So there has to be some prioritization of the alerts and some sort of rule salience. Like in data cleaning, we might have a rule that says, fire it if this value is blank. Then we might have another alert that says, well, this value happens to be a date, and this date can't be after the date of death. So fire it if this date's after the date of death. Well, you have to set up the rules to run to fire the blank check first and then the other one. Because if a field is blank, some of the other logic check rules won't run. So if you have any logic cross validation with 2 variable checks on, you always have to run blank checks first, or else you will never know that there might be some logic condition hit because the rule never ran because the field was blank. And you would never know to query to get in the field if you didn't put the rule on there that said go check the stupid blank field. So order of rules or rule salience can be very important in how they run as well. So then this is the logic slot is actually where the if then else stuff goes, the actual algorithm. And here's an example. So this is our potassium and digoxin. So if potassium is less than 3.3, and now in order to do this, right, they had to pre-process that data. So they had to know that 3.3 was in the units they wanted, and they had to make sure that all the potassium values coming from all the systems, no matter where they were, whether it's bedside or in the lab or with this analyzer or that analyzer or some external lab, they had to make sure all those data values were in the same units for this rule to even work. So there's a lot of pre-work that's needed with the data to make the rules work also. And then the action at the end, that little thing at the bottom, the last blurb, is actually the result that would display out for the physician. And there it is right there again. And so action slots can be a blurb printed out, but they can also be an action for the system to store something or to write something or to send something or to run another rule. So rule salience would be operationalized in Ardent Syntax through the action slot where a rule runs and then it calls another rule. And once you start doing that chaining of rules together, it gets logically really complicated. So it's a really big endeavor to use rules. It's not like managing 1,000 little packets. It's 1,000 little packets, and some of them are connected together in weird ways. You can also nest medical logic modules, call one from another. There's a template that George Herbschack gives to help write medical logic modules. If you or anyone is interested, this kind of walks you through what all is there and needs to be done.
How does it manage logic control for events which are recorded past the time that the event actually occurred? Like for lab values, which got sent off and maybe a length of time, and multiple things may have happened since then, to normalize it back to the time which it first occurred. You know what I'm saying? So that you can rerun logic modules over everything that happened before that time.
So in order for it to do that, you would have to nest them, or use this the action where one calls another. Otherwise, if the event is when the lab value is written to the data table trigger, then if the thing gets lost in the lab and something happens in the lab system, has a hiccup, and the lab values come in 2 weeks later, it runs when they come in, unless you do something with it. And generally we call those sort of edge conditions, the rare cases. Those edge conditions don't get dealt with until the physician sees the alert on the user interface. And often, like after a large Epic implementation, there are so many alerts and crazy things that they're seeing, like the one at Duke. When we implemented, after going live in the emergency department, the inpatient suites in 3 or 4 hospitals, and the outpatient clinics, we had 27,000 tickets. So 27,000 reports of, oh, I think this is broken, or I can't do this, or whatever. So it's that's another resource that's often not taken into account on implementation of one of these systems. But those edge conditions would end up as tickets if the physician even cared to report it, which often they say, crappy system, bam, override. I'm just saying. But thank you for the question. Oh, so the limitations, obviously curly braces problem is a limitation. The dates in there are quite complicated with processing dates and temporal issues that occur naturally within data. And then there's a huge amount of work in managing any type of decision support rule, which Jan hopefully has gotten over with his strategy of using knowledge tables rather than rules. So instead of having 6,000 of these rules to manage in this crazy fashion, Jan has 20 templates and 6,000 pieces of knowledge that are accessed through knowledge tables. So this is just some example there. It was one of the papers that I forget which one it was, and I can't believe I didn't put the reference, but I didn't. So this was an organization. It's 9, which is, oh, it's at the end of the presentation, okay. So they put into place 156 medical logic modules and they followed them for 78 months. There were 2,020 distinct versions with 5,528 total changes over time over that 78 months for those initial 156 little rules. And then they looked at where in the MLM the changes occurred. And then conclusions are that we need a more graceful way to evolve knowledge bases over time. And few organizations have addressed the complexity of doing knowledge management. So my guess is here with the limited resources that we don't have near the amount of decision support in the system that other places would be my guess. But I do know we do have other people helping out and writing it, not just not physicians necessarily. So Jello is an example of another expression language that can be used for rules. I'm not going to go into detail about it. I just wanted to bring it up. It's a little more modern than Arden. And it was balloted as an ANSI standard back in 2005. So just kind of in summary, so medical logic modules are files that contain rules. Rules are knowledge, and a collection of rules is called a knowledge base. So now we have databases for the data and knowledge bases for the knowledge. So how is a knowledge base different or similar to a database? Anybody want to hazard a guess? And then I'll repeat it for the folks online. Okay.
Well, I think it has key, it sort of has key values that activate when certain criteria are met. That's kind of like a database, that they have values associated with it.
Yep, stored
They're
data.
also different in that they are, once they read a value is being put in, they result in something new. It's not the data is inputted and sits there. It's that's translated over to some other action or alert that pops up for the user. And it kind of filters through the data and makes that something new.
Okay, so yeah, so for those of you online, they're sort of the same in that they both involve some stored data, like the rule itself is stored, but they're different in that the knowledge has some action or some dynamic aspect to it, rather than just being a stored piece of information. Did I summarize it okay? Okay. Okay, so how is a rule similar to a data element? Or different from? So what's in the curly braces for a rule?
Keywords.
Data elements. Yeah, so rules rely on data elements and use data elements. Okay, so this last one is kind of a gimme, I think. So how might standard data elements change medical logic modules?
Share them.
Yeah,
Between.
exactly. Consistency, no more curly braces problem. Okay, so you can do some practice. I put the Rorschach tutorial out there in the reading file if anybody's interested. For those of you that are in the clinical informatics track, there is a whole course on clinical decision support just ready and waiting for you.
When is that being offered?
We've got the course material?
Yeah, hang on and let me pull up the teaching schedule.
And your schedule's going to be Okay, cool. Then that's
Okay, so this is said teaching schedule. All right. So clinical decision support is this one. It will be offered summer 2018.
I'll think of it this summer. Actually, no, I can't, because I'm going to be all over the world.
Joseph Jensen's doing healthcare in the U.S. That'll be cool because there's rotations available with it.
Yeah.
Like I would love to scrub in with Joe. How cool would that be?
I want imaging. I want, not imaging, I want to turn data into visualization.
There,
No course of that.
yeah, that's into Watt's class. That would be good.
And then is the human computer interaction, that's what you're referring.
That's in the spring.
Is that on your phone or is that the new guy that's going to have technology, not you?
Yeah, so Joe Bonner he's a career clinical research informaticist like myself, and he has served as the chief data officer at Trinity Catholic Health East and at Ascension Healthcare. So he's actually a data warehouse, data analytics guy, but grew up in the pharmaceutical industry. Yeah, and so Joe is going to be doing the human computer interaction, and he's also going to be doing the clinical research informatics classes. He started work on developing those too.
Yeah.
So it'll be.
Now we're just making it as hard as possible.
No. It's I'm really happy because you guys need to hear about clinical research from somebody other than me. You need diversity. Well, there's a lot of overlap between those two tracks. Yeah, because you can't practice clinical research informatics today without understanding how information is managed in the clinical system. Exactly. So, yeah. So that's when it'll be taught. Okay, so with that, I'm going to, if there are no more questions, I hope you guys have a good afternoon, and we'll pick up next week. No, sorry, Thursday. It's Tuesday today, right? Yes. Okay. Well,
No, it's not on Thursday.
so we will pick up Thursday with knowledge acquisition. And for those of you in IT, it's going to be really frustrating. For those of you who are trained as researchers, you're going to think, well, it's just a research methods lecture, right? But it's kind of a little of both. It's weird. So I look forward to seeing you guys Thursday.
I went to